Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the European University Institute's 9th Annual State of the Union Conference, this year on 21st century democracy in Europe. I am pleased to introduce the Chair of the High Council of the European University Institute, Ms. Gunta Araya, and Professor Renaud Dehus, President of the EUI, who will deliver their welcome addresses.
Good morning to everyone, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants of the conference. As current chair of High Council of the European University Institute, I am very pleased and honored to open the 2019 edition of the State of the Union Conference. On behalf of High Council and the European University Institute, it is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you all here today and wish all of us fruitful discussions. Over the years, the State of the Union Conference in Florence has become a significant event in the European map of international events, bringing together academia, policymakers, and civil society, and provides as a unique platform where to discuss different topics of particular interest to Europe. This year's conference is devoted to the theme of 21st century democracy in Europe. In the year of European Parliament elections, this is an excellent opportunity to remind ourselves that in Europe everyone has the right to vote for or against something and freely express one's individual opinion. It is of a great value for all of us, and at the same time, a big responsibility for all of us, for those who use their right, for those who do not, and as well for those who are elected and represent our interests in EU decision-making and policy processes. For me and my country, Latvia, as well for other Central European nations that joined the European Union on the 1st of May 2004, this is an important year, as we are making the 15th anniversary of our membership in the European Union. It was a significant milestone of the processes that started another 15 years earlier. In Latvia, we strongly believe that there is a great potential of the European Union to foster economic growth and social development of the region, and that the European Union represents our common values. However, there are also some signs that citizens want to be more involved and informed about the European matters. This is particularly important to the young people. I am convinced that the EUI State of the Union Conference is an excellent opportunity to share views and discuss different aspects of functioning and development of the European Union. I would like to express my deep gratitude to all organizers and supporters of this event for their effort. Thank you very much. And now I am pleased to pass the floor to the President of EUI, Professor Renaud Dehus. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this 9th edition of the State of the Union Conference. The role of universities is not limited to teaching and research. It also includes what is normally referred to as the third mission of universities, to engage fully in dialogue with society. In today's world, universities everywhere face an ever stronger demand to link their research and teaching to this third societal mission. This is, of course, particularly true for an institution such as the European University Institute, partly because of its international nature, having been established 40 years ago by national governments. We must imperatively convince them, year after year, of the relevance of our activities, relevance to themselves and to the societies they serve. This challenge is compounded by the fact that the society to which we have to relate, namely the European society, is at best still in the making. Though all of them are European, our stakeholders have deep roots in their individual history and national culture. What appeals to some of them might cause others to raise an eyebrow. The State of the Union Conference is one of our responses to this challenge. This event provides us with a unique opportunity to relate to a diverse audience. Academics, of course, who constitute our traditional public, but also policymakers, civil society and business representatives, as well as opinion makers, to exchange views on some of the most important challenges European countries face. The theme of this 9th edition, Democracy in the 21st Century, will appear as evidence to many of you. On the one hand, the European Union is a unique laboratory in which we struggle to find replies to one of the greatest challenges of our times. Namely, how can interdependent societies, each with its own distinct identity, be governed democratically? Innovations such as the direct election of a transnational parliament endowed with real powers, or the more recent Spitzenkandidaten system, which features very prominently in today's program, are attempts at addressing this question. Whether these attempts will suffice is part of an open query. As everybody knows, the question is anything but moot. Gone are the days when Europe was considered with benign neglect by its citizenry. Its importance is now generally acknowledged, but its legitimacy is increasingly challenged in all member countries. Devising additional and innovative ways to involve European citizens will have to be envisioned and explored, which brings us naturally to the local dimension. I have stressed that our ambition with the State of the Union Conference was to relate to the European society at large. But this would not be possible if we were deprived of strong roots, strong local roots. I think of our many partners and sponsors that have unfailingly assisted us in the preparation of this event. There are too many to be named now, but I want to extend my warmest thanks to every one of them. I also think of the formidable convening power of the city of Florence, whose unwavering support contributes to the growth of the Institute. But let me also take the opportunity of the presence here today of the Italian Foreign Minister, Enzo Moavero Milanesi, to express once more our deepest gratitude to the Italian state, whose parliament just approved a few weeks ago the concession of a historic building in downtown Florence to host our new School of Transnational Governance. Italy has always been among the staunchest supporters of this institute, to which we reciprocate by conceiving ourselves as an agent of its soft power, which is great, as everybody knows. But none of this would be possible without the steadfast commitment of the many individuals who work tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that the right decisions are taken and duly implemented. Grazie, signor Ministro, a lei e ai suoi collaboratori per il vostro continuo sostegno a questo istituto. In conclusion, let me simply say that we could not have welcomed a better person to deliver the opening address of this conference. Having served for many years at the European level, both in the European Commission and the European Court of Justice, Mr. Moavero Milanesi has a thorough knowledge of European policy-making arcana. His positions in several Italian governments with key roles in the world of European and foreign policy have provided him with a unique platform to analyze the ever more difficult interface between national and European politics. I wish everyone a very stimulating conference and give the floor to Minister Enzo Moavero Milanesi. Thank you.
Authorities, ladies and gentlemen, dear Renaud, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here in this temple of European education. It would seem obvious to speak about European education, the European University Institute, here. But how much poor education and bad information about Europe do we hear every day? So to stop and think together objectively is important. In the prospect that within a few weeks there will be the elections for the next European Parliament. This is a reflection on the situation of the European Union, of the challenges, the opportunities that we have before us, on possible ideas that are feasible, that we could think about together. I would like to talk about this a little in my speech. I would like to start on a positive note. If we look at the history of Europe after World War II, it is evident that we, as Europeans, should be proud of having been the makers of this undeniable success, this long period of peace on our continent between states that have fought one another for over centuries. It's a historical result. It's a precious result, and one that too frequently we tend to take for granted. But it is the indispensable precondition for any evaluation we wish to make about Europe, Europe of today and the future Europe and the European Union. This intuition of blocking off peace towards a union of the markets to eliminate rivalries through a gradual bringing together of the economies has been far-sighted and very intelligent. The possibility of eliminating barriers, of creating a common market, was immediately based on basic precepts, precise rules of law. And these basic rules have been accompanied by the ability to create new legislation and to take care of this mechanism of a basic law which could ensue is something we find immediately in the European Steel and Coal Community. And we find this in the Court of Justice, with the task of being the supporter of this principle. And this was precious work on the part of the court in its early years, listing out the main principles with a uniform interpretation of law and ensuring the scrupulous observance and compliance with these juridical law norms, which gave rise to international law and which led to something which for every member state is closer to their home law, home legislation, than international law. And this idea of law, that is the expression of the first major judgments of the European Court of Justice, has constantly accompanied the economic community. This architecture, this legal architecture, is found here today in the values written in the first words of the Treaty of the Union, the first words of the treaty and its preamble, and also in Article 2. These are the values of the right of the person, liberty, democracy. This is the central theme of this occasion of the States of the Union, and equality and the rule of law. These are extremely important values that have accompanied that union, that closer and closer union that the states have determined to build. So here we are looking at a design that naturally, starting with economic features and progressing towards this common denominator, which is juridically well defined, has defined a political picture of a federal perspective. Even if we should not fear to pronounce this expression, which already in its declaration of the 9th of May 1950, Robert Schuman had pronounced explicitly, the dream of a united Europe without war has led to this political idea during that 30-year civil conflict of the early years of the 1900s, which took place amongst us Europeans, and has led to this genesis, which is of significant nature, with a pragmatic approach based on functional features. This approach has led to results. I would just mention a couple, which I think important, but we could mention many more. The first was the achievement and the dissemination of well-being and wealth amongst European citizens. This to an unknown degree, which wasn't known in the previous centuries and decades. This was a significant economic growth accompanied by the creation of jobs, permanent jobs, and increasing opportunities for all Europeans, an important result, which has also led to that interdependence between the European economies, which is one of the features which unites us most today in deeds apart from the laws. The second important result, maybe we don't fully recognize this because it works in our subconscious. It's almost a subliminal element. But we Europeans have all developed a sort of feeling of European affiliation. If we think about it, it has gone together with the national feeling, the local feeling, which we inevitably all have because of that natural bond with our own roots. It's not that false feeling of supremacy, which for many centuries has accompanied Europeans, nor is it that feeling deriving from facts from outside, that similarity of customs that, all things considered in the European context, have been typical of the different situations, irrespective of their geographical location. It's something natural. It's the birth of a spontaneous European identity. Those who live in the European space, in the space of the European Union, as a fact, in a natural, simple way, assimilates that being European. Here too, my reflection is that certainly everyone who has come to Europe or who was born in Europe after the 70s have a radically different vision compared with those who preceded them. They do not see European citizens of other countries as potential or real enemies. They have the opportunity, in general, in the education systems, increasingly, to study a different language from their own native language. They travel, they move around. There's the ease of communications, which helps also in immaterial communications. Here there's an enormous role played by the new technologies. We cannot avoid saying that we are European, even though looking at the news, it would seem we should think the opposite. But those who criticize and are skeptical towards Europe develops forms of thought that are fundamentally European, and even he or she who is skeptical is European too. There's been a gradual evolution of democracy in Europe. This evolution is positive and has accompanied this process of acquiring an identity and a socio-economic improvement on an overall basis. It has been a lengthy process that has taken many decades, but then gradually, and not all of a sudden, it has turned into a drop-off in enthusiasm, an increase in skepticism, and in a lot of contestation, a lot of people who are against the Union. Then this something which is really solid. A year early, in 1968, customs duties were eliminated between the states. The agreement appeared very great when it was established that the European Parliament should be elected by universal suffrage by the citizens. The agreement was great when, in 1985, the white paper for the completion of the single market, that is, knocking down all types of barriers between states and between Europeans. There was a great agreement when the European Parliament a year earlier had adopted that project for the Treaty of the European Union, which was Altiero Spinelli's vision, which had been discussed and then approved. There was great agreement also when, in 1986, there was the signature of the Single European Act, which gave a legislative role to the Parliament and which intensified common policies, which introduced a systematic majority vote within the Council. There was such a great agreement that thinking that you are riding the wave of those people who do surfing, there was a hope to crown the single market with a single currency, which would have unified costs, made everything more transparent, and unified further through the material quality of money that we carry in our pockets. Tackling the single currency also meant a very sensitive question which touched the chords of sovereignty and penetrated into the reality of the public accounts of each state. It was not a simple operation which affected identities and very concrete issues. We're now at the end of the 1980s, and at that point there were various discussions. But at the end of the 1980s, history changed. At the end of the 80s, the end of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the change in the political geography of Europe, which from a Western outlook, it opened towards the east, towards countries that were regaining their full freedom and national sovereignty and their democracy and their economic freedoms. Looking at these new situations, we as Europeans should have changed our attitude and tackled a deep reform of the institutions modeled or formed 30 years earlier. This did not happen, or it happened only in a partial manner. The differences in positions between governments contributed to this, and also a reaction. We remember the debate the end of the 80s, the big early 90s of the previous century, the position of the super European state in Brussels. And there were factors that contributed, inevitably accumulating during these positive processes of history. And this brings us to a second phase of the European construction, which has now been going on for about 30 years. This phase started with the Treaty of Maastricht. This Maastricht Treaty baptized the European Union and set up the Economic and Monetary Union. Two important points. European Union, for the very first time, introduces in its institutional body policies that are clearly not economical: internal affairs, justice, defense, foreign affairs. We see a big asymmetry in that treaty and in the effect it has on the basic treaties. The meticulous discipline of monetary union and very left as an embryo and left to agreements between governments, that of the non-economic policies. Well, a response, and on hindsight, was not sufficient. In fact, the Maastricht Treaty introduced, in order to be able to come into force for the first time, those who do not wish to follow some of the common policies, they are allowed to remain outside. Opting out is allowed for the Economic and Monetary Union, is for the first time a precedent that was then followed. This happened for the Schengen Agreement, and it happened for the possibility of having fundamental rights of the European Union, of the Union. Secondly, the Maastricht Treaty, for the first time, receives, or not, a no. That is, this is first time this happens in the European treaties. Not a preliminary no, nor a parliamentary one. It's a referendum. This no in the Denmark referendum opens people's eyes to this shortcoming in the mechanism of democratic consensus for the European integration process, even if then it takes place through a choice of opting out, which is solved. This is an alarm bell. But there wasn't just this no from Denmark. which makes us think of the sentences pronounced by Shakespeare in Hamlet. There was also a yes, which was very marginal in the French referendum. And this was a fairly strong signal. People's eyes were opened, but we were unable to fully respond to what our opened eyes were showing us. On the contrary, the responses in some ways were such as to complicate the problems further. For example, if we look at what started to happen in the end of the 90s and were taking place in the beginning of the 2000s, there was an increased number of bills proposed. And if we look at the treaty today, we see that there are not few juridical bases that haven't been implemented. And yet the success factors in the years of the first phase were these substantive, systematic, programmed proposals for bills which were on the calendar. There's a tendency to decentralize ideas. This was not mistaken to start with, but this decentralization was something which gave rise to initiatives on the part of states and did not produce the same results as the previous approach. It's almost something which you can look fondly at, looking at the sad end of the Lisbon strategy launched in 2000, which should have led Europe to be the most advanced area in terms of economy of knowledge by 2010 on a world basis. And we are left somehow perplexed when we look at the common foreign policy, which was put at the service of the Union, but does not replace, but it goes together with and duplicates the functions of the various national diplomatic services. When I say duplicates, I'm thinking of the places apart from the difficulty, the costs apart from being the difficulties in coordinating the mechanism. The system which we tried to introduce with a series of treaties in Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon. We should not forget the attempt of the Constitutional Treaty. It does not solve the situation, although in each of these processes there is a positive signal, particularly in terms of democratic reinforcement, more powers and more roles to the European Parliament, greater decisions, majority decisions within the Council. Nonetheless, the system is not such as to enable Europe to tackle the other major phenomenon of the new millennium, if we want to talk in these terms, in the years in the 2000, and that is a globalization. Commercial, economic, financial globalization. The globalization enters Europe. Not necessarily does Europe fully and successfully enter into globalization. New countries, non-European countries, gain great importance on world markets. Not only do they produce, sell, and grow economically, but they're also big non-European institutions that produce new technologies. Europe has a difference in the capacity to develop technologies, particularly in telecommunications. This is a warning to Europe because in perspective, the economic analyses tell us in 2040 no European country will be amongst the 7 economies in the world. And we know that until a few decades ago, there were as many as 4. Everything was made worse by the major recent phenomena, these big concerns, the crises, the economic crisis, the migratory flows. Europe has difficulty and is slow to tackle these events. It tackles them not always as best it could and with great difficulty. And this, again, shows the need for a real deep reflection and review from the institutional aspect. What I was able empirically to notice in my European experience, which was kindly mentioned by René Daus and recently in Italy, which is an active component of the European experience. I believe that if we do not have clear objectives in Europe, and these objectives cannot be explained or cannot be understood by citizens so as to mobilize people, there we have a problem. If we do not put at the service of these objectives an institutional machine apparatus which can allow the political will despite the difficulties to come together, we have another problem. The clarity of objectives is essential. The concrete objectives that can be understood is essential to maintain the consensus of citizens. Without this, we lose consensus. The institutional architecture of the European Union must be simplified, completed, made objectively closer, brought closer to citizens. It's a difficult architecture. Moving over for a moment into the shoes of people who try to explain the institutional structures and the European juridical system. It's not simple with all the differences that you are aware of. We must manage to modify these facts. Why has it not happened yet? This is because at a certain point there wasn't that far-sightedness that is a characteristic of quality leaders. This was a quality of the leaders of the 50s who'd come out of two terrible world wars, and they built what they did. At that point, we lost that vision, that long-term vision, and we found ourselves prisoners of a very complex current situation. This is what the citizens tell us. The useful instrument of the Eurobarometer speaks clearly. European citizens identify as a great, in the majority, some of these characteristics towards which it's difficult to maintain that we're providing answers. 50% of citizens identify migration as a big issue. Another 50% focus on economic growth and employment, particularly the problem of youth unemployment. And a good 40% focuses on the threat of international terrorism, on security and safety, and what can come from climate change. 7 Europeans out of 10 declare that they are in favor and enthusiastic about the possibility of free circulation of people. They believe that we should preserve and encourage the free circulation of goods and services, and this leads to reduction in prices and in services. Foreign policy and defense policies, common policies are sore points. Citizens speak clearly, and they tell us the needs. We should take action and model our actions on this basis. And this takes place, but partly. It doesn't always happen, and in any case, the results are lacking. Without these results, it's difficult to carry forward our political project. Europe's political project must aim towards further integration, and greater integration in a global sense cannot but lead towards a federative target. We can't tell fairy tales. We are unable to reach this goal at the present. We need new treaties. We need, for those who wish to, we need to work in that direction. And those who don't wish to, they will do their, they will be in the opposition, or they will not take part. But we need to speak clearly to the citizens. It's difficult to preserve and improve what we have built if we reduce it to a simple vision and preservation of a situation which, if it is not modernized, it runs the risk of dying of inertia or of exhausting itself. So this prospect of a new treaty, we all know, is difficult, it's complex, politically speaking and practically speaking, unanimity, application, referendum, ratification, and so on. But we cannot lose sight of it. It wasn't difficult in the 1950s, the early 1950s, 5 years after the end of a horrendous Second World War, which is the second act of an equally horrible war. We are already seated around a table. We should build what is lacking, what is needed, and what citizens are requesting. We can do this without touching on the treaties, although we need to look in that direction. I would like to close my communication, my report, with 5 proposals, 5 focal points, which I believe should be and can be developed even without changing the current treaties. The first of these 5 points, of these 5 proposals, is the attribution, and I'll explain what I mean by this, attribution to the European Parliament of the legislative initiative. We cannot imagine, nor can we explain, nor frankly can we understand that the European Parliament that we elect under universal suffrage, direct universal suffrage for the last 40 years, that it doesn't have this initiative for lawmaking. We like anniversaries, we like celebrating the 40 years of universal suffrage, the European Parliament. We do not need to modify the treaty or to amend it. I think that an interinstitutional agreement, which should be an intelligent one between the Commission and the Parliament, the European Parliament, and even the Council, will allow us to agree that the Commission will take over and then will present in pursuant to the juridical treaty. So it can accept all the proposals for legislation proposed by, for example, a political group to the European Parliament, or from an equivalent number of MEPs equivalent to the minimum which is necessary to set up a group, which could be a number of MEPs, a transversal group, transversal to the existing one. So an interinstitutional agreement, it would help the citizens to understand that there's over 700 MEPs who will vote in a few weeks' time, don't serve just to amend proposals prepared by others, but they're also there to be part of the direction for these legislative proposals. I think that what was justified in the 1950s, having an organism tending towards the European will, which has the monopoly of legislating today, is no longer justified with the same nature of being indispensable. Therefore, an interinstitutional agreement, ad hoc, I may say intelligent, that will allow the European Parliament to share with the Commission, which will obviously maintain it, this legislative initiative for the new European law. Second proposal, I think that we must give the word political commission a real meaning, substantive, which we generally give at a national level and locally to a government, to a council, etc. The electoral debate of these European elections is lively, it's strong. There are contrasting positions, it's transnational. There are strong movements and sometimes high in the sense of quality. It's a harsh debate, as a political debate must be. There are contrasting positions. We hear a lot about change. This will lead to a parliamentary majority at the European Parliament, this debate at the end of the month. This parliamentary majority at the end of the treaty will vote, elect the President of the Commission and vote on the College of the Commissioners. Can a citizen understand that after this harsh debate, the composition of the Commission doesn't correspond to the majority that was created in the European Parliament? It's a delicate subject. But if we want to talk about a political commission that works together with a political majority of the European Parliament, we must start to speak of a commission that, although it represents all states, takes on this connotation that corresponds to the majority established within the European Parliament. And this will be the responsibility of the European Parliament. It can be achieved. It will be the responsibility of the President, who will be designated and then elected by the European Parliament itself. The third point and third proposal, the European Parliament is an authority for the budget. It has responsibilities on the European budget together with the Council and the Commission. The next European Parliament, with its big files, big discussions that it will have to discuss, is the budget, the multi-year budget of the Union. This is essential because it gives an idea of the functioning of any type of institution or organism. And therefore, what type of budget will we give the Union? Is it the usual stifling 1-point-something% if we have a moment of extreme generosity? Or should we think of something more ambitious? Are we thinking of giving ourselves the means which are needed to carry forward what citizens are requesting? Or shall we tell them that we are going to do so, but we're not going to do it because we don't have the financial means to make an order to make this comparison, even though the differences are different? 1% of the budget, we could counterpose the 20% of the Federation of the United States of America. This is a federation, it's the USA, but between 1 and 24, I think there's a margin to do something better than 1%. How can we do it, though, if we don't tackle, as the first major issue, the European Union's own resources? Our own resources are our own up to a certain extent, because that percentage of VAT that we all pay and the customs duties of entry of goods into the EU, the rest of the so-called own resources is paid by the states on the basis of their national income. So it's paid indirectly by the taxpayers. So the states give up part of their income to make the union work. You don't need a psychologist to understand how little enthusiasm there is for this renunciation, this giving up this 1 point or 0 point something of the various options on the budget. I think, therefore, that the European Parliament that we are about to elect fully in democratic agreement, it can reason on its own resources, and first of all on its own resources, because before deciding how much I'm going to spend, how and what I'll spend, I need to understand how I will nourish this fund that I then intend to spend, this budget that I intend to dedicate. So let's call things without too much reticence with their proper name. So a new own resource for the European Union budget can be the issue of European debt bonds, and therefore all the states, all the enterprises, all the companies, many of us, when we make purchases such as a house or a flat, we get funds. Why could not the European Union do the same? So we take loans on the markets to fund investment projects, to fund operations for productive investments. A large part of the European Union budget funds technological R&D projects, and it budgets initiatives for major trans-European connections. It funds structural funds and relative actions that are downstream of this expenditure. So we fund all of this using the markets. It would be an excellent way of testing whether these projects are valid, if these projects have prospects, because markets don't fund initiatives that don't produce results. We use our bonds, European bonds, to allow this capacity to invest and not to spend other resources for the same purposes, or to increase this investment capacity, to increase the possibility of galvanizing, stimulating the economy. Second possible own resource, we have a percentage of VAT which goes to the European Union budget. Can we think of using other forms of taxation, European taxation that is? Naturally, I'm thinking of forms of taxation which must not weigh on the taxpayers who already pay their national local taxes. We know that the differences between the tax systems, of the member states that are not standardized, they're not harmonized, because the treaty requests unanimity, and there's never been this unanimity except for harmonizing the structures, the tax structures, but not the tax rates of the same. There are people who manage to do a kind of slalom between the various tax regimes in different states, choosing where it's most convenient for them to pay their taxes. Let's think of this situation, and let's create federal taxes which eliminate this distortion, which goes to the advantage of few big players, but with high income, big tax-paying capacity, and with great respect to us small people, manage to avoid taxes or pay fewer taxes. You just have to choose. We could imagine a tax on group leaders, holding company taxation at a European level, even a company tax. We could imagine, it doesn't take much to imagine this, so we could just think about setting up a tax on the giants of the web taxation, which we talk about. They produce income in various countries, and it's difficult to attribute it. So we could have a European tax, and this would strike people acting in Europe, and they manage to pay much less than people doing ordinary work. And there's a problem of climate change, the huge pollution. There are big cross-border polluters. Should we think of a carbon tax on these major polluters that can be effective in this way? Between these big transactions, this tax. It could be a common European tax. These taxes, which would not weigh, I repeat, on the citizen, the resident, who already pays tax in their own country, but it would weigh on those who work beyond these high thresholds, and they are transnationally, cross-border, and choosing their own taxes. This could have a positive effect with an impact, derived impact on the climate, and derived impact on these distortions which depend on a incomplete Europe. This kind of budget would enable us to implement the policies, foreign policy, and to implement more effective actions in the social field, and to have tools to counterbalance those asymmetries that have taken place between states during the economic crisis. That's the third proposal. The fourth concerns migration. I think it's essential for the European Union to adopt a common policy on migration. I'm saying migrations because I don't think about just the initiative towards those who immigrate into Europe, but I'm thinking of initiatives which are effective, which must start in the countries where the migrants start, where they leave because of wars, because of the lack of freedom, climate change, and they leave for socio-economic reasons because they don't have a sufficient future. There needs to be an important European investment plan, and we should have a larger budget to invest in the countries of origin or where the migrants transit. And so we need a European foreign policy for migration in the areas bordering on our continent. We need a capacity to intervene for assistance to migrants. So before leaving in the hands of person traffickers, they have human traffickers, we are able to help these people. If they're not able to find jobs, we need to find an agreement between the European states, enabling them to share out the burdens of this type and the burdens for those who come and cannot be left to geography or the decisions of the human traffickers with these charges borne by the countries where they first arrived. So we need an important migration policy. There is the legal basis in the treaty. I've seen this on various occasions. I read it. There isn't a basis for a European policy on migration. It's not true. There is one. We read the treaty. We read Article 78, Article 79 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And we see the legal basis. We read what's written, and we ask for legislative proposals, initiatives which enable us to create a real migration policy at a European level. European citizens, 7 out of 10, say that it's a priority. 5 out of 10 say it's a European matter. Fifth and last proposal. I experienced this as a Minister for Foreign Affairs in the monthly meetings. Here too, let's be honest, there is not a true foreign policy for the European Union, as there is not a real defense policy for the European Union. This is essential for safety of citizens and to counter phenomena such as terrorism, be present where we need to be to carry peace and to be able to work in a more united way on the major international questions. And it's not there for various reasons. Jealousies among governments, the role of policies, difficult to abandon that stage, the inefficacy of the European instruments, the overlapping of administrations and bureaucracies, and the treaty that says everything must be decided unanimously if there's a consensus. I think with the stimulus on the part of the European Parliament, answering the requests of citizens with this logic of democracy, we could ask governments to agree amongst them a sort of pact that the decisions about foreign policy should be taken on a majority basis. It's revolutionary, but it's feasible. We do not need, dear friends, only to think of the major amendments to the treaty. A lot can be done using the current treaty. We can do plenty, but we must be committed. And in electing the European Parliament, we've got to look at this catalyzing moment which can trigger this process, and then not lose sight of meta-politics, where we should work towards a new treaty for Europe which give it a more federal structure. Thank you.
Good for you.
May I have your attention, please? Participants for the next session, Basic Income, the Future of Social Policy or an Expensive Fad, are kindly invited to remain in this room. For those attending other sessions, I would kindly ask you to go to the other rooms now so that the conference can stay on schedule. If you need help finding the room, please ask any of our staff members at the help desks outside.